Hi, I'm Jo Clark, and thanks so much for joining me today. This is the Redefining Midlife podcast, a podcast designed for the 40-plus woman who is determined to challenge society's myths and beliefs around midlife. It's for the woman who is inspired and ready to define midlife her way. Join me each week as I chat to health and wellness experts for up-to-date information on how to live well, as well as some special conversations with incredible everyday women redefining what midlife can look like. Here's to making our next half of life even better than the first. If you're a woman in the middle of life, chances are you've experienced hot flushes or night sweats, brain fog, sleep issues, and low moods. The menopause transition can give a smorgasbord of brain-based symptoms that for some women can be debilitating. And today we're going to find out exactly what's going on with our brain during the menopause transition with my guest, Australian-based but Kiwi-born neuroscientist, Dr Sarah McKay. Now, Dr McKay is a neuroscientist who translates brain research into strategies for professionals working in health, education, and coaching. Basically, she makes it easy to understand for us all. And she received her PhD from Oxford, but after 5 years of postdoc research, she hung up her lab coat to set up Think Brain, which is a science-based communications business that bridges the gap between the lab and everyday life. In addition to this, Sarah is also a speaker, author, and founder of the Neuroscience Academy suite of training programs. She is the author of The Woman's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones, and Happiness, which explores a female lifespan through the lens of neurobiology. Now, on a side, this is a really fascinating book and led me personally to undertake her course called In Her Head just a few short years ago. In addition to this, Sarah has also recently published her latest book called Baby Brain, The Surprising Neuroscience of How Pregnancy and Motherhood Sculpt Our Brains and Change Our Minds for the Better. I hope our conversation helps you understand your brain just a little bit better. Enjoy the episode. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Dr. Sarah. I'm really looking forward to asking you questions about the topic of how a woman's brain changes in the middle of life and hearing all that you have to share.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Jo.
Such a huge and unspoken topic, and there's so much we don't know. So this is going to be very useful for women to hear now, no matter what phase of life they're in, and also for the men who might be listening. It's really important to know what's happening to the woman's brain at this stage of life as well.
Yeah, I always say my work is for women and the men who love them.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great way of putting it. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of this topic, I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. So could you share with us about how you got into the area of neuroscience? Because it's relatively a new area. And plus, being a woman would make you an even bigger rarity, I should imagine. So what actually attracted you? Was it something you wanted to do from a younger age, or did you start?
Look, I always loved school, and I always read books, and I used to, even when I was a little child, there were a lot of nurses in my family, and I used to love reading their medical textbooks with all of the diagrams of the body. And I even remember reading first aid manuals and just finding that just so fascinating. So I really went through school with an interest in science and biology, but I also did a lot of art as well. I had lots of things I was interested in. And I went off to my first year of university and did, then I think it's still the case in New Zealand. I'm not up to date with what happens there anymore. It's sort of a broad first year of biology, chemistry, psychology, English. And in the psychology lecture, or in the psychology course, Psych 101, they had a section on the biology of psychology. And that was my absolute first introduction to the brain and neurons and synapses. They didn't teach that in high school biology back in the early 90s. I know they do now here in Australia because my kids have done it at high school. And I was just like, get out. That is the coolest thing. I just was captivated by the idea of synapses. And we were also told to go away and read a book by a neurologist called Oliver Sacks, who's very well known, and his kind of most famous book. The title's confusing if you haven't heard of it, but it's called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And he was a neurologist who wrote these wonderful stories about, I shouldn't say wonderful stories, tragic tales of the patients who came into his clinic who had various, disorders or damage or deficits within their brain, and the thoughts and behaviors and feelings that emerged from that. And I was just captivated. Really, that was in 1993. And I moved universities to a university that had just started offering a degree in neuroscience. So back in the early 90s was when the discipline of neuroscience sort of first started coming together as a degree discipline. And even today, I'm still as captivated as I was then with that topic. The comment that you made on being rare and neuroscience is not actually correct, because
is that right?
Neuroscience has always had gender equality, you know, and if you look at the health sciences and the medical sciences, the psychological sciences, there's always far more females than males. And in neuroscience, you know, it's always been 50-50. When in my first year of my master's, I did a master's and PhD in neuroscience at Oxford, and there were 5 of us that were awarded a Wellcome Trust scholarship to do that 4-year program, and 3 of the 5 of us were women, young women.
Yep.
So I'm not rare. That's never been the case in neuroscience. That said, in terms of where does my interest in women's health and neuroscience intersect, it never occurred to me until 2016. So in the previous year, I'd written an article for the ABC on menopause and brain fog, but it was really kind of the first time, and I didn't really think about menopause because I was in my early 40s. It was some far distant land occupied by other women. And I'd written that, and then in early 2016, I was approached by my book agent. She rang me up and she said, "Hey, I've come across your profile online. Would you like to write a book?" And I said, "No, no, no." And she said, "Oh, go on, let's meet for coffee." And she said, "What have you ever written for an audience that has resonated?" And I mentioned this menopause article. She said, "Well, what about a book on menopause from neuroscience?" And I was like, "Oh, that doesn't really sound like my kind of jam." And then she said, "Oh, what about baby brain? Is that a thing?" Talking about pregnancy and motherhood. And I was like, "Well, that's a load of rubbish." But then it was those 2 questions over that coffee that I suddenly kind of had an aha moment of, I thought, I'm studying neuroscience all my career. And here I am, the owner and operator of a female body and brain. And I've never really kind of considered women's health through the lens of neuroscience. It just hadn't occurred to me. And I used to say it was because there's just so much cool neuroscience out there. But what is more so the case is that we have seen within the last 5 years this absolute sort of surge. It's kind of, you know, come of age, kind of considering the woman's lifespan through the lens of neuroscience, puberty, pregnancy, menopause, aging. The research has kind of blossomed in that. And there wasn't really any research in sort of 2015, 2014, you know, the kind of early 2000s really to pay attention to. But now there really is. But it's still very, very, very new. So I kind of went down. I've just sort of followed my nose down that path and wrote the first book looking at the female lifespan, and the second book focusing in on pregnancy and motherhood, because I saw the science was not parallel to these stories that women were telling themselves. And I suppose for me, well, one, I also thought baby brain was, I couldn't see why Mother Nature would make mothers stupid. There's no, I still, that's kind of the take-home message, really. But it's almost as if we have a female body, and then we add in a brain, and then we add in reproductive capacity, and it's almost as if we think that absolutely equals cognitive impairment and emotional instability. You know, QED, and that is not the case. And so, you know, I'm trying to share the good news stories and the upsides, and have a strengths-based focus to these conversations instead of it being solely focused on deficit.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you've got the science to back it up now, because it was always hearsay and society telling us that a woman's brain behaves in a certain way, whereas now, if you can find things that are matching what the findings that you're going to be reporting in the women's brain book that you've got and the baby brain book that you've just released, that helps to change the narrative.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's you know what I'm trying to do. And when I sort of sum it up and by saying Mother Nature didn't intend mothers to become stupid, that sounds flippant, but essentially that's the case. And luckily the neuroscience is backing me up.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's been exciting to be at the forefront of a lot of these things in neuroscience. Now, being someone who loves to learn and being somebody who is an educator in trying to promote the findings in simple to understand and easy to understand language, because that can sometimes, well, I'll use a flippant term, dumb it down for people so they can understand it, because there's a lot of a lot of terms that we wouldn't understand as lay people, and how to interpret that research is huge for someone like you to be able to give to us.
Yeah, well, I just love doing that, and such a great place to be in, because I get to think and talk about things that I'm still going, get out, that's so cool about neuroscience, and then I get to talk about it and make meaning of that and talk about things that matter with people. So the conversations that we can have, it's just it feels very self-indulgent, to be honest.
Well, enjoy. I remember buying your first book, the Women's Brain book, because I was really interested in that whole topic about how our brains change over the different phases of life as a woman. And then I learned more a couple of years ago after joining your training in Her Head. You've got other programs and a new book at which you've discussed the baby brain. What sort of other programs have you got that people, may be interested in as well?
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. So I've got sort of 3 types of training programs. I've got a sort of an introduction to neuroscience and brain health, applied neuroscience and brain health, that consists of 17 lessons, sort of starting off with the basics of brain anatomy and physiology and working our way through things like motivation, cognition, emotion, through to brain health, sleep, nutrition, exercise, social connection, etc. And that can be consumed as a student in a number of ways, sort of through self-directed online learning, or we teach that as a 12-week program. So we kind of do a couple of lessons a week. It's quite a nice sort of gentle stroll, or a faster paced 2-week course that kind of sits under the heading, the Brain Coach Bootcamp. So that's a kind of an introduction to applied neuroscience and brain health. We've got the Women's Brain Health course, which I just taught last week. I now teach that over 5 days. We just smash it out. It's super intense. And that's really fun, because there's a real kind of collective effervescence. There's a real kind of a collaboration that emerges, and a nice vibe when you're kind of meeting daily to talk about these ideas. So I've kind of moved my focus, having taught online now for a number of years, to, we've got the online learning component, but let's focus on the conversations, and in the live Zooms, I talk about the gist of the ideas. I do research updates, and then I encourage juicy conversations and sort of sharing of experience and ideas. So there's the Women's Brain Health course, which really takes a kind of a lifespan perspective of how the brain changes and is sculpted by life, and in turn, how it guides various aspects of our biology. And then I have a sort of a follow-on course from that called the Neuroscience Coaching Network, that I teach in partnership with my sister-in-law, actually, who is a PhD coaching psychologist who works in Dublin, Ireland, with the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. And she has a very strong background in leadership training and HR and coaching psychology. And we wanted to kind of bring together our skill set, not just because we're family, but because we wanted, and it's the Neuroscience Coaching Network, which is really bringing together neuroscience and coaching. We wanted it to be, again, it's about collaboration and conversation. We bring in speakers. We have a really strong focus on group work. We put people into small groups for them to go away and do projects. And we've had like little businesses kind of formed from the collaborations as part of that. So as much what I try to apply these principles of building rapport and building kind of collectivism as part of the teaching, because I think that that's how adults like to learn. And if we're doing this online, make it as much of a group process as possible. And that's really sort of applying neuroscience principles to adult learning as well.
Yes. Well, you certainly got a lot on your plate, as well as being an author who's promoting a brand new book. So where can people buy your books? Is it bookstores?
The Women's Brain book is called Demystifying the Female Brain in Europe. Online, you just Google me.
Yes,
but both of them are available as ebooks globally on Amazon. The most recent one, Baby Brain, the Neuroscience of sort of Pregnancy and Motherhood, is only out in paperback in Australia. So if you're in the US and you want to pay shipping costs, be my guest. Buy from one of the online bookstores here. It'll have to get shipped to you, but you could buy it as an ebook. And the second book is also available as an audio book, except I am not narrating it.
Oh.
We have a professional voice actor. I because I got fired. No, I didn't go fired. I'm not very good at narrating books, as it turns out.
Well, it's a bit hard, isn't it? I mean,
we had a trial, was decided to bring in a professional, and that was really good. Freed me up.
as long as you weren't
Maybe
offended
40
too
extra
much.
hours. It's a bit of a funny story. We don't need to get into that. But so there's lots of ways you can consume.
And link and finding you online. Put all the links in the show notes as well. But
yes, Dr. Sarah McKay. So just Google Sarah McKay neuroscience.
Yep, and on Instagram. Yep, you're on Instagram as well.
On Instagram and LinkedIn. And,
beautiful.
Yeah, you can find out about the courses and all of that in those spaces.
Yes, fantastic.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back.
All of the changes in the middle of life can leave you exhausted and depleted. So I'd love to invite you to a very special free masterclass that's going to help you go from surviving to thriving before, during, and after the menopause transition. Now, there are way too many women in their 40s and 50s who are unsure about what to expect during the years of perimenopause and how they can best manage their symptoms and health before, during, and after this phase. But that doesn't have to be your story. I'd love you to join me for a free masterclass where I'll share 3 topics about the menopause transition that every woman should know, like what's happening to your body and why, the range of symptoms that you might experience, plus simple ways to support your body during and after the transition. Now, I've helped thousands of women learn more about the menopause transition and how to prioritise their well-being, and I'd love for you to learn more about this phase as well. Because when you know more, you'll feel less overwhelmed, more empowered and confident. The free masterclass is online via Zoom on Wednesday, the 12th of July, 11 a.m. or 7 p.m. You can register now by heading to joeclarkcoaching.com/thrive. Now, back to our episode. So we'll get on to the nitty-gritty part of the interview now, Sarah, and we'll talk about the area of women's health because it's really not a very well-researched area. It's only quite relatively new, as you spoke earlier. Can you shed a little bit of light on the history of why that is the case?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it sounds sort of like there was this patriarchal conspiracy to exclude women. And I think part we could blame the patriarchy for everything, can't we? I think some of it was intentional and much of it was non-intentional. However, it has kind of ended up having negative consequences, but that is changing. So for a long time, and you still sometimes see this, I just saw something on Twitter recently that was describing women as non-men. We still consider the male as the standard human,
Yes.
and women are kind of as an aside, made from Adam's rib, goes all the way back to the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And so for a long, long time, when sort of health medical experiments were done, they were sort of done on young, fit, healthy men. And often that was because young, fit, healthy men and universities were the ones who volunteered. Women may have been excluded for some good reasons. Perhaps they would fall pregnant and the drug that was being tested could impact the fetus. So we're not going to include women who are possibly liable to fall pregnant. So, there was perhaps a good intention there, but it's ended up having a negative consequence. Sometimes it is simply, and a lot of animal research that's done within medicine and science, the sex of the animal was simply just not included. I spent many years in the research lab running many experiments looking at spinal cord injury and brain development and deafness, and I never recorded the biological sex of the animal I was working on. And if I did record it in my lab book, I may have written like a little, male or female symbol. I certainly never included that in my analysis. So sex as a biological variable was never included in analysis, not because I was trying to exclude females or only include males. It just simply never occurred to anyone that biological sex may be important if we were looking at aspects of the brain that weren't anything to do with hormones. If you were a neuroendocrinologist, you would pay far closer attention. But outside that space, which is was kind of niche, just didn't seem relevant. And I wasn't excluding sex as a biological variable because I wanted to exclude women. It just simply wasn't a consideration. But now we're understanding, and I think the good news story is we are now understanding, one, sex as a biological variable is interesting and important, and is often mandated to be included if you're applying for research grants or getting papers published. And if you haven't included it, you have to explain a good reason why. So we're starting to see a shift. there's lots of kind of funny stories about that. I know a scientist who was doing research on the placenta and was asked to explain why males weren't included. So sometimes there's still a bit of a tick box. These things kind of move back and forward. So we're starting to see a shift. And also I have this personal idea, and I don't know whether it's playing out. I said at the beginning of this conversation that we've always had gender equity in terms of males and females entering undergrad neuroscience degrees and PhDs, etc. But like any profession, the women kind of drop out as we, go and have babies, and we don't necessarily make our way all the way up to the top. But what we are starting to see now is my generation of women, Gen X, are now working our way up to the tops. We're the ones running the research labs. We're the ones applying for the research grants. And we're the ones that are actually going, hey, you know what? Wouldn't it be really interesting to know what happens to the brain when we're on the pill? Wouldn't it be interesting to know what happens to our brains when we fall pregnant? And we're asking these questions, and then we're thus able to answer them because we can be, we're kind of finally have made our way up through the ranks to be able to do so. So I think we're starting to see that shift as well, and that's just gaining momentum.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that men are not interested. I spoke to a data analysis scientist a wee while ago who's done kind of big data analysis, like you get brain scans from biobanks of thousands of people and do kind of AI computer analysis of them. It's not my field of expertise, but she was interested in motherhood and looking at middle-aged women and looking at motherhood. Can we see traces of pregnancy in the brains of women who are 50? And so you can look at that data using big data analysis. Big data is dominated by men. And she went to a big data conference. She said about 90% of men, and she presented this data on motherhood, and she was kind of like, oh, how's it going to go down? She said they were fascinated because it's a really interesting intellectual question. And they've all got mothers. Many of them have wives. They have children. They have daughters. We don't have that, sometimes you hear stories that it's very sexist and women are dismissed. We're not seeing that. We're starting to see a real shift, and people are going, this is actually intellectually interesting, as well as just being meaningful for women. It's not mumsy. It's not a mumsy niche.
Yeah.
It's actually come of age.
That's in our favour as women anyway, that there's that interest there. So
Yeah,
Sarah, this podcast is for women who are in the middle of life, and that means for us that's the declining estrogen because of the menopause transition. I'd just love for you to be able to share what's happening to our brains during this stage of life and what effects that can actually have for us.
Yeah, well, I hope we aren't defining midlife solely by declining estrogen.
No,
as I
not
say,
at all, but it's one of those.
The strengths-based focus. It's not one of deficit. However, if we are to look at a hormonal profile and our neurological profile, as we enter our mid-late 40s, we start to go through perimenopause. And I mean, I don't hear anything anymore. That's all I hear these days. All the women's health, all the women's media.
Yeah, well, I suppose all of a sudden it's out there, so people want to consume as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a hot topic.
And
again, I think it's a generational shift.
Yes.
We've got my generation of women coming in, and we can talk about the HRT disaster in a moment, but who are going, hey, you know what? Well, I'm going to approach this phase of life like I have approached every phase of life, with a bit of agency and autonomy and asking questions and standing up for myself. So a little speech aside. So we know in puberty, the brain kind of switches on the sort of the brain ovarian conversation. So we've got the hypothalamus in our brain, which constantly receives data about all kinds of states within our body, including hormones. And it can send signals to the pituitary, which releases a hormonal signal back to the ovaries. And that kind of kicks off in puberty and tracks along nicely every month, changes up a bit when we're pregnant. And then we kind of reach our late 40s. What happens is it's not the brain that gets tired, it's the eggs and our ovaries that get tired. And as they age, the release becomes a little less efficient and reliable. In some months, they may, the ovary may, along with its egg release like a ton of estrogen. So imagine it's like a roller coaster, it's up and down and up and down. And we're talking about a feedback loop here. So when you release a lot of estrogen 1 month, the brain's like, whoa, calm down. It's almost like it's being shouted to by the ovaries. And so then the brain is kind of sending a signal back to the ovaries going, just chill. And the ovaries go, okay, And then the next month they hardly release any, and the brain's going, no, I meant a little bit louder. And so you kind of get a few months of the brain and ovaries having this kind of, a few months or years, crazy roller coaster in conversation. It all becomes very erratic and irregular and unpredictable. And that erratic, irregular and unpredictable up and down of particularly estrogen, and we understand most about estrogen, we don't understand as much about progesterone in the brain. The hypothalamus, which is receiving the estrogen signal, starts to alter in terms of how it responds to these ups and downs of estrogen. And we understand mostly from a neurological perspective what is happening in terms of hot flashes and sleep and those kinds of symptoms. So we can go through the symptoms. What we also understand is what happens if we kind of zoom out a bit and look at the brain and the nervous system, actually the whole body really in totality, and look to see how it transitions the whole way through, kind of from your early 40s, say through to your late 50s. We've only just started to understand that because the first paper that was published that described that kind of neurological shift was only published in June 2021. 2 years ago,
isn't it?
2 year
Wow.
second birthday, that paper this month. And that was from the lab of a woman, a neuroscientist called Lisa Mosconi. And she did very, very good analysis, scanning women at various ages through that transition. And she also scanned men's brains of the same age, not because we're always including men and women's health, but because we wanted a chronological age, kind of a comparison with this hormonal shift. And what we see is quite a striking structural reorganization and physiological reorganization of the brain across that shift. So there's kind of two ways we can talk about how the brain changes in structure. We know how it changes physiologically, and then we also understand how the changing in estrogen levels, if we kind of dig inside the brain, results in some of the symptoms that we experience.
I'd love to hear more about the symptoms and effects, because that's what a lot of the women that I work with and come across are really interested in. What the heck's happening and why?
So just to give a strengths shout out, we do see the brain adapt across this phase. So it's not like it's going into decline. In fact, we see the grey matter getting thicker. Maybe that's downloading of wisdom. We see the brain adapt and then kind of settle into this new phase of life. So our brains remain adaptable and compensating for the kind of physiological changes that we're experiencing in our body. The estrogen story in terms of hot flashes and sleep problems, and perhaps building on top of that, I suspect maybe things like mood disorders, brain fog, etc., is reasonably well understood. And so if we zoom in on the hypothalamus, I said it's constantly receiving data from our ovaries about estrogen, but it's also receiving data about things like body temperature. And so in your hypothalamus is a thermostat, and we're familiar, a thermostat in our house has an upper level and a lower level of comfort. And so we can set that comfort level. And when the room gets too warm, the thermostat will signal we've got to do things to cool down. And similarly, in our brain, the hypothalamus goes, we've got to do things to cool down. So we sweat, we go red, we take our clothes off, we have cold water, whatever, we seek cool. And when it gets too cold, we do things to warm up, like we shiver. So there's a physiological response, and then we might put more clothes on. With all of the ups and downs of the estrogen, the upper level of the thermostat goes down and that bottom level goes up. So the window of comfort is a whole lot narrower. Yeah. And so what happens? Our body temperature only needs to rise a slight amount internally for it to kind of tip over the top level of that thermostat. And the hypothalamus almost kind of goes into sort of like panic response. And it's like, it's hot in here, it's hot in here. We have to behave in a way to cool down really, really quickly. And so that's why you have this kind of enormous surge of heat and sweating. And if you're asleep at night, you need to wake up to behave in a way to cool down. You can sweat, but then there might become a point when your brain needs to wake you up. And so it sends this burst of adrenaline through your body, which makes you kind of wake up going, whoa, which is similar to the burst of adrenaline we see in response to sleep apnea, just as an aside. So that's kind of what's happening in terms of the dysregulation of body temperature. And we know that estrogen plays an important role in that, because if we use menopause hormone therapy and put estrogen back in, we can reset the thermostat, and that is one of the best physiological treatments we have in terms of kind of helping with the thermoregulation. So what's the link to sleep? It's not simply that you may be waking up with this kind of panic stations that you've got to find a way to cool yourself down. Sleep and body temperature are really intimately entwined. So imagine what it's like to try and get to sleep on a really, really hot night. It's hard to fall asleep in a really hot room, because part of falling asleep involves melatonin release. And what melatonin does is sort of release your body heat out into the room. And it's the cooling down of your core body temperature, which helps facilitate sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have dysregulated thermoregulation, it is a lot harder to necessarily release heat, and, you know, for all that to be kind of precisely timed. So it's harder to fall asleep even if it's not hot, because body temperature regulation isn't kind of ticking along as usual. And also through the night when you are asleep, body temperature is a really important part of promoting healthy sleep architecture. So moving in and out of deep sleep, like REM sleep.
Yeah.
And if body temperature is disrupted, you're too hot. You know, if you're a young, healthy, fit male and you're too hot, you might wake up in the middle of the night. Even if you're not waking up with a hot flash or night sweats, your sleep architecture is still disrupted if your body temperature isn't correctly regulated. And so you're sort of having disrupted sleep, even if you're not aware of waking up.
Yeah.
What happens if you have one night of disrupted sleep, a week, a month, a few years of disrupted sleep? What kind of builds on top of that? It's almost inevitable that we start to experience things like brain fog, not being able to pay attention, you know, issues with mood regulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. High risk of diabetes, high risk of poor health. You're not going to want to eat healthy food. You're not going to want to exercise.
Yeah.
You just get this cascade, this sort of snowball effect.
Yes.
So that's kind of one of the most well understood kind of mechanisms. We also know that estrogen, quite simply, is like a cognitive enhancer. It you know, does a lot of great things for our body and our brain. We like to blame hormones. We think, these hormones, aren't they terrible things? But actually, a lot of estrogen is really good and healthy for you and promotes brain resilience and has a whole lot of positive aspects in terms of building a healthy brain. And so when you kind of withdraw that, we do see the brain start to respond. But the link between that directly into something like brain fog is a little less clear. And there's a really interesting parallel between brain fog and baby brain and pregnancy, in that women will say I'm not saying they say they experience it and it's not true. They report the subjective experience, but when we do cognitive testing on them, we're not picking up cognitive decline, which is good news. We don't want cognitive decline. But women who experience lower overall well-being during pregnancy and motherhood are more likely to say, I have baby brain, even if we're not picking up any cognitive deficit. It seems to be a phrase when we just kind of feel unwell, we can't kind of do it all. You know, there's kind of almost broad poor well-being, and emerging from that is kind of foggy fuzziness. It's not a neurological deficit, it's just more a symptom of overall.
But it's just a difference to where you normally perform and how you normally feel. And when you're tired, you can't perform and you can't. And
you probably perform quite well in the research lab because you're cool, calm and collected and there's no distractions. You haven't got your kids, you haven't got competing demands. What you remember depends on your attention, what you can filter in and filter out. And in a much more sort of straightforward environment, it's easier to kind of cognitively perform than when there's kind of, it's a bit more chaotic. And I think that that's a really useful thing to think about, because whilst we can't necessarily change your physiological state, or I mean, we can alter our hormones now, but you can't stop the aging process, right? But you can put all of those support systems around you to ensure that it's an easier process.
Yes.
And you would talk about that all the time. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the sun. You've got to get your sleep right first.
Absolutely. That is the key cornerstone.
That's absolutely key. That's the foundation on which we build healthy nutrition, exercise, social connection, social support, having good, healthy, strong social networks around you is one of the key indicators of the health outcome. And having people where you're having conversations where I get really disappointed when I hear people even talking to young girls about, you know, puberty blues, and it's almost like we start feeding them this deficit-based story before they even get their first period. And they're petrified about that, and I'm going to be hemorrhaging, and it's going to be this terrible thing. Luckily, I wasn't brought up with that message. It was quite exciting and it was celebrated. And to surround yourself or to start conversations that are much more positive about that phase of life, that's another, you know, piece in the support puzzle. And
it's one piece that's what's so key, I think, at this stage of life too, because for many women, and myself included, it's a bloody fabulous stage of life to go through.
It's great.
And and going through this transition is just one part of it, but there's so many other benefits. And to be probably, I think, to be informed, to know what's happening,
absolutely,
it's so important.
And I think it's so important to be informed and to stand up for yourself. And like I say, put your big girl pants on and find a GP or a women's health specialist that you can have a conversation with. If you're dismissed, dismiss them back. You know, you're not 12. If you're not going to get to your late 40s, early 50s and take a bit of ownership over your own health, and, you know, develop good relationships with healthcare providers as well, who are going to help support you too through this phase. And part of that is education. And I know not every woman has the skills or the ability or the resources to be able to do that, but I think those of us who do, we need to sort of have those conversations and promote those ideas. And especially here in Australia, we're really fortunate with the resources that we have available to us.
We certainly are. And being the biggest advocate for your own health is so important. Although in saying that, there are a lot of people who do find their doctor hard to talk to because they don't have the understanding of what's happening of this stage of life.
For sure.
That's sort of another issue. Now, talking about, you sort of gleaned on it just a little bit before about how having some hormone replacement therapy can help. So there was, and this is a really interesting topic, because can you explain how this can be such a great option for some women, as well as a reason why there's still some hesitancy around this treatment? Because this is sort of a historical issue, but it's still rooted today.
Yeah, for sure. I'm seeing the hesitancy fade away, which is great, I think. And again, I think this is generational. Depends on where you were and what you were doing back in 2002. So up until 2002, women were just popping HRT like it was a lolly globally. It was just being handed out in the same way the contraceptive pills handed out, which is not necessarily a bad thing. However, a couple of big studies were published in 2002 around the same time, the big one being the Women's Health Study. It was a large trial looking at HRT and looking at health outcomes, looking at everything from heart disease, strokes, cancers, osteoporosis, etc. And what they found was, looking at all of the women in the trial, there was an increased risk of heart disease and breast cancer, osteoporosis, etc., stroke. And the results came out, and about 50% of the women in the world globally who were on HRT stopped. This is massive, massive drop. And everyone freaked out about it, and it became like HRT was just this dangerous drug to stay away from. But what has happened kind of in the 21 years since, is that we've kind of gone back and we've looked at the data and analysed that and taken a closer look. And it turns out that a lot of the women who were started on HRT in that trial were many, many years past menopause. They were in their 60s and 70s. And it turns out what we now understand is that there is kind of a healthy time, a healthy window of opportunity in which you can start hormone therapy if you're symptomatic and you choose to do so. It's not compulsory. If you want to, because you're suffering from hot flashes, say, or you want to kind of give it a whirl, and you don't have various risk factors, particularly risk factors for estrogen positive breast cancer and a few other diseases. So long as, if you're perimenopausal or within a few years of your final period, it's still safe. It's those women who are much older, it's almost as if their bodies had weaned off estrogen and then we added it back in, and that was what caused the increased risk. So we now understand they were too old for it to start taking it safely. And I think what's really interesting, again, we're seeing this generational shift. We're seeing women in their mid-40s now who weren't even aware that there was issues back then because they were only in their mid-20s and they were clubbing in 2002.
Yes.
Hadn't even had babies yet, you know, they were busy partying in London or something. They aren't concerned, they don't carry that fear. There was this enormous global news story. And then now kind of looking at the various options. We've also started to gather a whole lot more information about combinations. Are you taking it as a pill? Are you taking it as a cream? Do you still have a uterus? You haven't had a hysterectomy. You need progesterone as part of that formulation so you don't end up with an increased risk of uterine cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So we've started to gather more information as well around, you know, a bit more of a sort of a personalized approach to who are you, why do you want to take it, and what would be the best kind of solution for you. So I think we're now at that point, and women are having the option of making a well-informed decision based on risks and benefits versus 20 years ago when it was just all fear-mongering.
Yeah. And that's important for women to know, that there is something there should they want to choose that pathway.
I think I did meet a women's health specialist the other day who said she's kind of gone back to giving it out like lollies.
Oh, is that right?
I mean, I don't think that's like it's just out in the street in a lolly scramble, but you know, we've got a better decision-making process around that, but that has to be talked through. That's why we need a good healthcare provider who we can have a proper conversation with and talk about the risks and the benefits, the upsides, the downsides, etc. Because we've all got individual risk profiles that need to be considered. As I said, it's not a free-for-all lolly scramble. It's a healthcare decision.
And it's every woman's journey through this is absolutely unique, isn't it? It's like, well, it's puberty in reverse. So if you go back and think about when you were going through adolescence, every girl's experience was different, and that's the same.
And you know, some of us sail through,
absolutely,
some, you know, struggle through, and some are kind of somewhere in between. And you know, that we all want to sail through, because that's the ideal. We want to sail through puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. That's the ideal. And you know, we understand where the risks lie and the opportunities lie. And again, it's those things we talked about. Taking that whole health approach, including the social health, you know, approach to that. Make it as easy as possible for your body and brain to go through this sort of shift. We now understand there's actually some other kinds of ideas out there and research being done, not just on this sort of window of opportunity as if there is this particular age, but these ideas of health span versus lifespan. And there's this sort of idea around the healthy cell bias. So we've got a biological age, which may be older or younger or the same as our chronological age. So the sort of the fitter and healthier your cells are, the more receptive they will be to taking estrogen without the negative health consequences. So there's that to consider as well. And how can we, I mean, you know, I have terrible genes. And I look at my mum and my dad, and I already look at my sister. So I think I have to work, I'm starting from a very healthy, solid base. I've got to work that much harder to maintain my health than my husband. Everyone in his family lives till their late 90s, and they didn't even do anything to get there. Mine will die off in their early 60s from everything under the sun. And so, you know, I'm quite happy to work quite hard on my health. So I can get through.
Same, and that's my story as well. Genetically, it's not great, but I know that I've got, there's a lot of power that I've got within me as well to make a change and to do all I can to support my body now. And that's to look at my lifespan further down the track. So bringing on to, you know, this is a segue then, Sarah, of we talked about brain fog not being is sort of just a point in time. It's not Alzheimer's disease, and of course, so many people are fearful of Alzheimer's disease, and you know, particularly the fact that 2/3 of all patients who suffer from Alzheimer's disease are postmenopausal women. So, what I think I would like you to be able to talk about now is what we can do for self-care for our brain health, looking into the future as well. So, what sort of things would you encourage women to do?
Yeah, well, I think about Alzheimer's disease as a disease of aging. It's not a healthy expected outcome. And honestly, there's nothing new under the sun in terms of the health advice to give, and it's not dissimilar, to be honest, in terms of having healthy, good metabolic health, good cardiovascular health, the sleep, the exercise, the nutrition, and then because it's our brain we're talking about here, we've also got these other kinds of cognitive healthy habits that we could use. The social interaction, of course, is an enormous part of that, because one of the most cognitively demanding things we can do is interact with other people. But also sort of staying engaged, having purpose, being interested, being a lifelong learner. We have quite clear evidence, and this is perhaps more relevant for people who are elderly now than younger generations coming through, that how intellectually engaging your job was, or how many years you spent in formal education, so how much your brain was constantly being challenged. We can see that also builds in some cognitive resilience. So we can have a brain that's perhaps starting to show signs of aging, that still functions well because it's got resilience built in a way. So thinking about all of those things that we can do to move ourselves towards that sort of state. So, the food, the diet, the sleep, finding ways to find your place or moment of calm is how I talk about stress reduction.
Yes.
I would never recommend anyone do mindfulness meditation personally, just because I find it really hard. That's my personal. I just think it's really hard to use your mind to control your mind. It's like trying to hold a moonbeam in your hand,
I see that as a challenge, and I bloody love it. So
I would rather use a bottom-up biological approach. If I'm feeling psychologically stressed, I would rather move myself into a different state, a different place, a different state, jump in the ocean, have a nap, take my dog for a walk, than stay where I am in that moment and try and use my thoughts to change my thoughts. I'm just hopeless at that. So
it's finding your own recipe, isn't it, then, if that's the case? So it's finding what works for you.
Absolutely. Find what works for you, and don't think, oh, well, I can't practice mindfulness. It doesn't work for me, therefore I have no tools. I think that's been over promoted as the answer. And it doesn't necessarily work for everyone all the time, me being one of them. So I have other ways to reduce the outcome being stress reduction. Doesn't really matter how you get there, you find the path up the mountain that you enjoy climbing. So there's all of those things. So all we can really kind of do is tip the scales in our favor as well. We can't determine every outcome. We can't do everything right. And often we see all the people that did all of the things right and they still get sick. We see people who've never smoked a cigarette in their life develop lung cancer. The scales were tipped in their favor, but they still had a bit of bad luck. We also see people that don't necessarily do many things right. The oldest living woman to date on this planet was Jeanne Calment, who's a French lady who lived to age 124. Well, she was still smoking at age 107. So she did lots of things right, but the smoking was a bad idea. But it didn't. Obviously, she had a great deal of biological resilience. So I think what we can't come up with necessarily a recipe for longevity, but we can just tip the scales a bit in our favor. And why wouldn't you? One, not just want to live longer, but live healthier. Because wouldn't we all I think that Queen Elizabeth, regardless of whether you're a Republican or a monarchist, wouldn't it be great to be working up until the day before you died?
Yes. How amazing is that?
She did all of the things correctly, not necessarily because she made the smart choices. She was born into the right postcode. She was born into wealth and privilege, and that helps. Much better than being born into socioeconomic deprivation. She was socially, intellectually, cognitively engaged. I mean, she was meeting the new Prime Minister of England the day before she died. You can't be doing that if you're, kind of dopey and not on the ball. She was fit and healthy. We knew she rode her horses. She was always kind of out and about doing things. And as a female, she also had 4 children. And we know that if you are a mother, you've had pregnancies and you've raised children, that's reasonably cognitively demanding as well. And we know it promotes a more youthful brain. Up until, if you have more than 4 children, the stress of the whole thing of having a big family washes away that benefit. But again, she had 4 children. She didn't smoke. Look at her sister.
Yes.
Who smoked and drank. So the Queen did all of the right things. And I think that the fact that she was still on the ball, she was still interested, she was still out there engaged in life, that's where health span and lifespan meet. And I think that That's what we should all be aiming for.
Absolutely.
We're not queens.
So, yeah, we are all queens in our own right. Yeah. So living well for longer is definitely key for all of us to aim for. So what's one actionable step that you would like to leave listeners with today?
Oh my goodness.
I know there's lots, but is there something that you
I think if you haven't got your sleep in order, everything else is that much harder. So the basics of sleep hygiene don't just sound like good ideas. It's a biological mandate almost. You know, the cool dark room and no phone and no coffee and no alcohol. I'm terrible. I still like a glass of wine every now and then at night. But if I was a bad sleeper, I would be far more regimented. I think if you've got sleep as your foundation, other things are easier to build on. And then, I've just started jogging again, which I can't say I'm loving, but I kind of felt like I needed a new sort of exercise. I needed to really stretch myself in a way that I was kind of almost getting in a bit of a routine, going to the gym, doing some pump, doing some swimming in the ocean. But I felt I really needed a stretch. I needed not a challenge, but I needed to make something hard.
Yeah.
And so I've started doing that, just because I'm kind of aware that it's getting more important to
move,
and be a bit. It's good for your psychological resilience too. Like your body's not gonna build resilience unless you really push it. And so how can I push myself at my age? How can I, find ways to sort of rough the physiology up a bit?
Yes.
And so I've started doing that.
Well, that's going to help us sleep as well.
I'm still being overtaken by some very elderly people. I do a kind of granny shuffle. My husband says there's a lot of up and down movement. I'm running. He says I'm going up and down a lot.
Do you remember old Cliff Young? He was a long distance runner, and he ran in his ultra marathon in gumboots. He was I'm probably showing my age now, but this would have been back in the early 80s. Old Cliffy Young.
Oh, how funny. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing, and I can't say I absolutely love it, but you don't have to love it. It's just as important.
You don't. Absolutely.
Yeah, and do it. I'll do a load of other things as well, but yeah, they're my.
So sleep is your number one.
Sleep, yeah, and if you can't do anything else, that's you've got to get that right.
Yes.
Then other things will be easier.
Yes, for sure, because you won't feel like moving, you won't feel like eating well, you won't. Yeah, it's hard. So Sarah, this is a final wrap-up question that I always ask my guests: that if you could look into the future, what do you hope 80-year-old Sarah will say about current day Sarah?
Probably something like, well, good on you, love. You figured out what worked, what made you happy, and you just went with it. And I think, isn't that the lovely thing about midlife, is that you can, there's no shoulds anymore. And the things that I love and enjoy, I can just kind of wallow around in, even if it's doing a jigsaw puzzle, listening to a podcast. And I hope I will look back, and I've never really been one for regrets. I hope I look back at this point now and also feel pride. I'm so proud, because I have teenage boys right now, how they're turning out. And I'm also so proud. I'm so proud that we all got to this point, and so I hope that there's a sense of pride, and also that I have enjoyed this phase of family life as well, because it's a really nice time.
It is,
and all you hear is bad stuff about teenagers, especially teenage boys, and I'm their biggest cheerleader. So I hope I'm doing it right now, so I look back and don't think, I should have done it differently. I don't want regrets. Don't do regrets.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much today, Sarah, and thank you for all that you do, because it's sharing your information with us today on the podcast, sharing it on all of the things that you produce, your books, the posts that you have, the research that you're a part of. It really makes a difference to all of us. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for the invitation to chat.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for listening and sharing your time with me today. I'd love you to hit subscribe on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast app to keep spreading these empowering messages. Please share this podcast with other incredible midlife women in your world. Join me again next week for another redefining midlife conversation. Thanks again for tuning in.